Okay, so I hope everybody's doing well today. I am going to be going over the chapter on the heart, which is chapter 20. It's a long chapter, so I anticipate getting through a good chunk of it today and finishing that up on Friday. I hope many of you were able to at least view the recording from last Friday where I used a whiteboard to kind of make a rudimentary attempt at showing you how the blood flow through the heart works. Again, that's really important, I think, for understanding this chapter and the next chapter to just understand how the blood flow goes through the heart, whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. So if you haven't looked at that, go back and look over it. I did save just the whiteboard drawing as well, and I posted that on your Moodle page, so you can take a look at that. Today we are going over the PowerPoint, which is all figures from the text, so we're not going over that whiteboard picture, but hopefully, I'll keep referring back to that and hopefully you'll have some of that in your mind. I'm not expecting anybody to have this down perfectly yet, just the more times that you see it, the more it starts to make sense to you. So I'm going to share my screen and I will open up our PowerPoint. Here we are, chapter 20, the heart. So again, we already went over the blood. We talked about red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, plasma, right? And then on Friday, I went through the blood flow through the heart. I used a whiteboard. I used blue and red pen to try to draw this as best as I could. Today, we will be going through the heart, right? And so again, when we're talking about the cardiovascular system, we're talking about the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels. We already talked about the blood. We will talk about the blood vessels next week. And so the heart, which we'll talk about today, is kind of the center of that cardiovascular system. It pumps the blood through the vessels. The heart beats approximately 100,000 times every day, and it pumps about 8,000 liters of blood per day. Give me one second. So one thing you need to realize when you're talking about the heart, and hopefully you've already realized this from Friday, is that every time you're talking about one cycle of blood through the heart, there are two circuits. It goes through the left side of the heart, and then it goes back through the right side of the heart, right? And that's one complete circuit. So you're always talking about going through the heart twice. You're talking about going, I should say, go through the right side first. That's the way we drew it. And then through the left side. Blood flowing from the right side of the heart. Remember, we drew that in blue, meaning it does not have oxygen. It goes through the right side of the heart to the lungs to pick up oxygen, and it comes back into the left side of the heart. That is known as the pulmonary circuit. The pulmonary circuit is right side of the heart to the lungs and back. The heart or the blood then comes into the left side of the heart. We're using red, meaning that it does have oxygen. It leaves the left side of the heart to go to the systems of the body and give up that oxygen and then come back into the right side of the heart to start over again. The blood flowing from the left side of the heart to the systems of the body and back into the heart is called the systemic circuit. Right? So you always have these two circuits going. You have the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Pulmonary is right side to the lungs and back, systemic left side to the systems and back. And so here's an overview of the cardiovascular system. You can see the pulmonary circuit, right? Pulmonary arteries carry the blood to the lungs, the capillaries in the lungs. Pulmonary veins carry that blood back into the left side of the heart. Systemic circuit, you have all these systemic arteries that carry blood everywhere from your head to your toes. Okay, and then you reach capillaries, give up oxygen, which we'll see in the next chapter. And then the blood flows back through the veins to the body, so systemic veins, which are blue, back into the right atrium of the heart. The types of blood vessels are arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. As I said on Friday, always remember artery away. You both start with A. That's the easiest way to remember it. You'll always be right. Veins always carry blood back toward the heart. They're returning blood to the heart. And in between the arteries and the veins, you have these tiny little vessels called capillaries. So they connect the arteries to the veins. They are actually the blood vessels where gas exchange happens. And so we'll talk more about arteries, veins, and capillaries in the next chapter. There are 4 chambers of the heart. We talked about these a little bit. All right, these name them. The 2 upper chambers are called atria. You have a right atrium and a left atrium. You have a right ventricle and a left ventricle. Those are the 2 bottom chambers. Okay, and so again, the blood coming into the right atrium is part of the systemic circuit. As it goes from the right atrium to the right ventricle, it's considered a pulmonary circuit. Goes out to the lungs, comes back into the left atrium. That's still pulmonary circuit. When the blood goes from the left atrium to the left ventricle, that's systemic. Goes out to the systems of the body, back into the right atrium. That's part of the systemic circuits. Then we get into the anatomy of the heart. What does it look like? What is it shaped like? Well, the great vessels connect to what's called the base, and the pointed tip is the apex. And it sits in 2 pleural cavities in the mediastinum. So let's break that down. The apex, if you think about the apex of anything, it's usually the point, right? We think about the apex of like a mountain as the top, it's the point. Well, in the heart, it's facing down. The apex is actually down, it's facing down. Pointed tip is inferior, it's pointing towards your feet. The great vessels are connected to the heart at the base. So your apex is down like this. The great vessels are connected up at the top, at the wide part of the heart, which is the base. So that's kind of the superior part of the heart. And by great vessels, they mean the really large blood vessels, the large arteries and veins. And it sits between 2 pleural cavities in your mediastinum. So your heart is sitting in your thoracic cavity. Right? The area that it sits in the thoracic cavity is called the mediastinum. Right? So the thoracic cavity is your whole cavity that's surrounded by your ribs, which includes your heart and your lung. The cavity where just your heart sits, right in the middle there, is called the mediastinum. And on either side of that mediastinum, you have 2 pleural cavities. Right? You have 1 pleural cavity on the right, 1 on the left. Those are surrounding the lungs. And so here's a picture of that. Right? Here's your heart. The pointed part is the apex. The apex is pointing down towards your feet. The base is up at the top, it's the wider part. And that's where the large blood vessels are at the base. And it's sitting in this center cavity called the mediastinum. You have a lung on each side. The lungs are sitting in pleural cavities. The heart's sitting in the mediastinum. Okay. Surrounding the heart is the pericardium. Peri is a prefix that you'll see a lot in anatomy. Peri means surrounding, right? I think of the perimeter around a building. So the pericardium surrounds the heart. The outer pericardium is fibrous. The inner is the serous pericardium. And anytime you have a serous membrane, it is a double layered membrane. Okay, so the heart is surrounded by a double layered membrane. What that means is that one layer covers the heart, one layer lines the cavity that the heart is sitting in, so that when the heart beats and it moves, those 2 layers are rubbing against each other rather than doing any damage to the actual organs. The outer layer in any serous membrane is always called the parietal layer. The inner layer in any serous membrane is called the visceral layer. Right? We have a serous membrane surrounding each lung. We have one surrounding our heart. We have one surrounding our digestive organs. So when you see serous membrane, that's always an indication that it's a 2-layered membrane. The outer layer is always parietal. The inner layer is visceral. In the case of the heart, that inner layer is the same as the outermost layer of the heart. So the heart itself is made of 3 layers, which we'll see in a minute. The pericardium is not one of those three layers. It's considered outside those three layers, right? It's surrounding those three layers. It's not considered one of the layers of the heart, but it's something that surrounds the heart. The pericardium itself is made up of two layers, and the innermost layer of the pericardium, the visceral layer, is the same as the outermost layer of the heart, the epicardium, which we'll see in a minute in a diagram. Between these two layers, in every serous membrane between the two layers, is a small cavity containing fluid. Okay, so the pericardial cavity is the cavity between the parietal and visceral layers, and it contains pericardial fluid. It contains a little bit of oil, basically, to lubricate it so that those two membranes can slide against each other without friction. Okay, so here's a view of the heart from above. This is a view right through the thoracic cavity from above. You can see here for orientation, here's the vertebrae, here's the right lung, here's the left lung, your sternum is here, chest, here's your heart, right? And so the heart itself is surrounded by, well, there are two lungs surrounded by pleural cavities. The heart itself is surrounded by the pericardium. Here's the pericardium. So here you can see kind of the location of the heart in the thoracic cavity. Again, just taking away all that other stuff, showing you the parietal and the visceral layers of the pericardium over here, right? And this, they always use this as a demonstration as to why there's two layers. So your heart is kind of like your fist in here, and there's two layers of a membrane around it. This would be the visceral layer. This would be the outer layer, which is the parietal layer. And there's a little bit of space between the visceral and parietal layer. That's the pericardial cavity. So sometimes you hear people having pericarditis. Itis always means inflammation, right? So this is inflammation of the pericardial surfaces. It can be caused by different pathogens like bacteria that get into the pericardium. And what happens is it restricts movement of the heart. You can imagine if this layer surrounding the heart gets inflammation, then it's kind of stiffening up and not allowing the heart to beat as much as it should. A lot of times this happens because of excess fluid that is in that cavity that builds up. So we get back to the anatomy of the heart. We have the atria, the upper chambers. The upper chambers have very thin walls. Remember, they only have to pump blood down to the ventricles. So they don't have to push blood very far. They don't have to have a lot of muscle surrounding them. What we will see is that the ventricles have a lot of muscle. Ventricles have to push blood much further, so they need to be strong. There are grooves in the heart, and those grooves are called sulci. You may recognize that word from the brain. It's the same word for the grooves in the brain, sorry. And sulci are the grooves in the heart, on the surface of the heart. They contain fat and blood vessels. Okay, when you look at the outside of the heart, you can see a coronary sulcus. You can see one coronary sulcus, groove, and that marks the border between the atria and the ventricles. That's going horizontally across the heart. Then you can see that that's the separation between the atria and the ventricles. There's also one going vertically down the middle that separates the right and left sides of the heart. Okay, it's called the interventricular sulcus, and it's between the right and left ventricles. Here's where the heart sits, just relative to your ribs, right? It is protected by your sternum and your ribs. And here is finally a look at what the heart looks like. Now, this is an anatomical drawing of the heart, so it's a little bit different, obviously, than what I drew on a whiteboard. Again, here is your base, the wider part of the heart. Here's the apex down at the bottom. The large blood vessels are attached at the base. Here's your right atrium. Your left atrium is over here. There's your right ventricle and your left ventricle. And on the outside of the heart, you have what's called a coronary sulcus. It separates the atria and the ventricle. So this right here, which is just shown as fat, that's actually a little groove, and the groove is filled with fat and blood vessels. Okay. You have the same type of groove that separates the right and left ventricles. That's called the interventricular sulcus. Again, it's a groove, but it's filled with fat, so it's not really indented anymore because it's filled with that layer of fat. So here is a cadaver heart, the anterior surface of the heart. This is what it looks like from the front of an actual cadaver. So this is a drawing, obviously that's a cadaver. Same things, you can see the coronary sulcus. You can see it's more of a groove here because the fat is gone, but you can see where the blood vessels are. You can see the interventricular sulcus on the anterior side. That's where the blood vessels are. Okay. And then this is the back of the heart, right? This is the posterior picture of the heart. So again, you can see the right and left atrium and the right and left ventricles. They're separated by that coronary sulcus. And then the right and left ventricles are separated by the interventricular sulcus. This time it's the posterior interventricular sulcus. Okay. The heart itself is made up of 3 layers. Those 3 layers are the epicardium, the myocardium, the endocardium. So epi always means outer, myo means muscle, and in many cases that's the middle layer, as in this case it's the middle, and endo means inner. So the inner surface of the heart is covered with the endocardium. Pretty easy. The middle of the heart is made up of myocardium, which is cardiac muscle. Right, that's the muscle that makes your heart beat. The outer surface of the heart is the epicardium. Now, the epicardium is the innermost layer of the pericardium. So remember, our pericardium had a parietal layer and a visceral layer. The visceral layer of the pericardium is the epicardium of the heart. The same layer, the same thing. And here you can see, we've kind of just taken a section through a part of a heart wall. You can see the inner part of the heart is lined with a thin layer called the endocardium. It's just this thin layer here. But then from here to here, right, all of these pink cells, these are all muscle cells. So this is the myocardium in the middle. Then the visceral layer of the pericardium is this epicardium, this yellowish tannish layer here. The epicardium, which is also the visceral pericardium. And then you have your parietal pericardium out here. All right. So here is, this picture is just showing how the musculature wraps around the heart, kind of wraps around in a figure-8 pattern. And if you watch a heartbeat on a monitor, you'll see it kind of twisting like this as it beats. So the muscles of the atria, right, they wrap in these figure-8 circles, or I'm sorry, in these circular patterns. The muscles of the ventricle kind of go in the swirling pattern. And that's to kind of wring the blood out of the heart. You get the most out of those muscular contractions of the heart. The chambers are separated by muscular partitions. They're called septums or septa. So just like in your nose, you have a septum that divides the right and left sides, right? You have an interatrial septum that divides the right and left atria. You have an interventricular septum that divides the right and left ventricles. And inside the heart, we have these valves. Now, I talked about these on Friday as well. We have 4 valves. We have 2 of them that are called atrioventricular valves, or AV valves, and 2 that are called semilunar valves. The AV valves, atrioventricular valves, exist between the atria and the ventricles. So you have one between the right atrium and the right ventricle, run between the left atrium and the left ventricle. The one between the right atrium and the right ventricle is called the tricuspid. The one between the left atrium and the left ventricle is called the mitral or the bicuspid. One term is not more correct than the other. They're both the same. And what they do is they just allow blood to flow in one direction. So once blood flows from either atrium down to the ventricle, that valve slaps shut so that blood cannot flow back into that atrium. It can only keep going forward. Right? And then we have valves that are right where the arteries leave the ventricles. Right? So blood always leaves the heart through a ventricle into an artery. The right side of the heart, so the right ventricle goes into the pulmonary artery. The left ventricle leads into the aorta. So right at the beginning of the pulmonary artery and right at the beginning of the aorta, you have two valves. They also prevent blood from flowing backwards, so that once blood flows from the right atrium into the pulmonary valve, into the pulmonary artery, a pulmonary valve slaps shut so that the blood can't flow backwards. Okay. The same thing with blood flowing from the left ventricle into the aorta. Once it flows into the aortic semilunar valve slaps shut so that blood cannot flow back into the left ventricle. So when we drew the blood flowing through the heart, we said, okay, once blood leaves the left ventricle of the heart, it goes to the systems of the body. It goes head to toe, goes to all these little tiny arteries and small capillaries. And it gives up oxygen because that's the purpose of the blood, right? To carry oxygen around the body. Then that deoxygenated blood has to get back to the heart to start the whole thing over again. And so it comes back into the right atrium of the heart to start over again. Well, the vessel that carries the blood into the right atrium of the heart is called the vena cava. It's a vein, right? And the word vein is kind of right in the name, vena cava, vena cava. The vena cava is actually divided into two parts. There's a superior vena cava and an inferior vena cava. All that is the superior vena cava is draining blood from your head and neck, from everywhere above your heart. So your head and neck, like your shoulders, anywhere above your heart. Your interior vena cava is draining blood from everywhere below your heart. So your abdominal cavity, your legs. What else do we have for anatomy of the heart? It turns out that the way that the heart forms developmentally when you're an embryo, it kind of starts as one long tube that kind of keeps twisting and folding on itself. And so you have this tiny little hole in the right atrium, kind of between the right and the left atrium. And it's called the foramen ovale, right? So before birth, it's an opening through the interatrial septum. Remember, the interatrial septum separates the right and left atria. Right? So before birth, you have a hole through there, and it connects the two atria of the fetal heart. So in the fetus, there is blood going from one atrium to the other, back and forth. It closes at birth, and when it closes, it leaves a mark there that you can see on the heart, on these models and on the diagrams, called the fossa ovalis. Many babies are born without that being completely closed, right? Many babies are born, infants have oftentimes a hole in their heart. You've probably heard that before. And it's something that has to be monitored really closely. And most of the time, it's going to close back up relatively soon after the baby's born. But that is, that is a concern, right? If a baby gets to be, if the infant grows and grows into a toddler and everything, and there's still a hole, there's still mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, then surgeons may have to go in and do some sort of a procedure to to eliminate that hole. The right atrium also contains muscles. They're called pectinate muscles. They look like ridges on the wall. So on the inside wall, on the inner surface of the atria, there are these little ridges, and they're called pectinate muscles. They're not very big. Remember, atria just have to pump blood down to the ventricles, which are right below them. So atria don't have a ton of muscle, right? They don't need a lot of muscle. They don't need to push blood very far. So that's the right atrium, right? We're starting at the right atrium. The right atrium has the foramen ovale, the hole in the heart, which hopefully closes up by the time the infant's born, and it becomes kind of a little scar tissue called the fossa ovalis. And the right atrium has these pectinate muscles. From the right atrium, it has to go into the right ventricle, and it does so through the tricuspid valve. So the right atrioventricular valve is called the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid because it has three cusps, has three little flaps, prevents blood from flowing backwards. And the free edges of the valve are attached to what are called chordae tendineae from the papillary muscles of the ventricle. So in the atria, we had pectinate muscles, right? In the ventricles, we have what are called papillary muscles, which are more pronounced. They're kind of these bigger ridges. And attached to the flaps of the valve, or from the flaps of the valve to these papillary muscles, are these chordae tendineae. Those are literally your heart strings. They look like strings. They're really connective tissue, dense connective tissue that attaches very strongly to the valves, right? So that when the muscles are beating, it's pulling the valves really tightly to prevent blood from flowing backwards. So again, you can see those things on the heart. So here is the right atria and the right ventricle of the heart. You can see blood's flowing into the right atrium. Here's the inferior vena cava, bringing blood from below the heart, and the superior vena cava, bringing blood from above the heart. Right? They're both blue because they're both carrying deoxygenated blood. If you follow the arrow, they're both bringing blood back into this right atrium. In the right atrium, you can see the fossa ovalis. That's where the foramen ovale was, right? That's where the hole in the heart was. This heart is fully formed, so now it's closed. You can see these little ridges that are called pectinate muscles. From the right atrium, it's going to flow down into the right ventricle. When it flows through this opening, there is a valve called the tricuspid valve. This is one of the three cusps of the tricuspid valve. There's one there, the second one there, and the third one here. Attaching to each cusp, there are these strings that attach to muscles in the ventricle. The muscles that they attach to are called papillary muscles. The strings themselves are called chordae tendineae. And they're the heartstrings. They're labeled over here on the left side. But even on the right side, they're called chordae tendineae. In the right ventricle, you have these bigger muscular ridges. Again, the right ventricle, either ventricle is going to have more muscle than either atria. The muscular ridges on the internal surface of the heart of both ventricles are called trabeculae carneae. And then you have this moderator band inside the right ventricle. It's a ridge that delivers the stimulus for contraction to the papillary muscles. So we've got the trabeculae carneae are these muscles here, okay? So the muscles that the strings are attached to, those are called papillary muscles. The other ridges in both ventricles are called the trabeculae carneae. I don't think they show the moderator band on here. Oh yeah, they do. So this band right here at the bottom is called the moderator band. It's only in the right ventricle. It allows for kind of that twisting motion so that when those muscles contract, they twist the heart. It reminds me of like you're wringing out a towel or a sponge. It's trying to wring out the heart, wring out all the blood. So this is actually what it looks like inside the heart, inside a human heart, right? You've got the chordae tendineae attaching to the papillary muscles. So this would be one of the cusps of one of the AV valves attaching to the chordae tendineae, which attach to the papillary muscles. Okay, and again, here's what it looks like on a cadaver heart. And so at the superior end of the right ventricle, so at the topmost end of the right ventricle, is the conus arteriosus. It ends at the pulmonary valve. It's 3 semilunar cusps. It leads to the pulmonary trunk. It's the start of the pulmonary circuit. So right where blood's flowing, so blood's going from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava into the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Then it's going to flow. It's kind of coming out of this picture towards you, coming out of the screen towards you. It's going to flow into this large vessel, right, labeled the pulmonary trunk, which becomes the pulmonary arteries. You can see these two are going to the left lung. These two are going to the right lung. Well, right where that pulmonary trunk leaves the right ventricle, that's where you have the pulmonary semilunar valve. So this pulmonary valve, that's a semilunar valve, and it's got 3 cusps. This region of the right ventricle is called the conus arteriosus. It looks like a cone, right? So blood, if you're following the arrow, it's going to come up through this conus arteriosus, pass through the tricuspid valve into the pulmonary trunk so that it cannot flow backwards through that pulmonary valve into the right ventricle. Okay. That's the start of the pulmonary circuit, right? At that point, blood is going to the lungs. Pulmonary means lungs, it means breathing. So you're going to the lungs to get oxygen. And it does so. It goes to the lungs, it picks up oxygen, which we'll talk about later. It comes back from the lungs through pulmonary veins. And the blood actually passes into the left atrium and it keeps going down into the left ventricle. Basically, the mitral valve is open. The mitral valve is the bicuspid valve. It's the left AV valve. It's open, and so blood flows right into the left ventricle. So here you can see these 2 arrows, right? Blood is coming back. These are your left pulmonary veins. Right pulmonary veins will be behind here. You don't really see them because they're behind here. Those veins bring blood back into the left atrium. The blood doesn't just stay in the left atrium because this valve is open. Blood starts to fill the left ventricle as well. The left ventricle is similar to the right, but it does not have the moderator band. That's the band that allows the muscle to kind of perform the squeezing motion or the twisting motion. But blood leaves the left ventricle through the aortic valve into the ascending aorta. So again, I'm going to go back to that picture. So you can see once blood flows from the left atrium to the left ventricle, right, this valve, the bicuspid, will slap shut. You still have the chordae tendineae, you still have papillary muscles, you still have trabeculae carneae. You don't have a moderator band. Blood is going to flow from this left ventricle up into the aorta, right? So it's following this red arrow here. Where the aorta leaves the left ventricle is kind of right behind this pulmonary arch, this pulmonary trunk. So the aortic semilunar valve is right back here. It's right behind that pulmonary trunk. So it's doing the same thing, right? It's allowing for blood to pass into the aorta. It then slaps shut so that the blood can't go backwards into the left ventricle. So you just can't really see it in this drawing because it's right behind the pulmonary trunk. So it's going to leave the left ventricle through the aortic valve and go into the ascending aorta, the aorta going up. And then there are these aortic sinuses. Sinuses are just kind of areas that fill up, right? They're kind of these empty or hollow areas. They are at the base of the ascending aorta. The ascending aorta becomes the aortic arch, which becomes the descending aorta. So at this point, it's still called the ascending aorta. It makes an arch that's called the aortic arch. Then it goes and travels down behind the heart. You can't see it because it's behind the heart, but it's bringing blood down to your abdomen and your legs. That's called the descending aorta. Okay, so now we're still on the anatomy of the heart. What if we compare the left and the right ventricles? Well, they hold and they pump the same amount of blood, right? They both are capable of holding the same amount of blood. They both push the same amount of blood. The right ventricle has thinner walls than the left ventricle. The right ventricle develops less pressure than the left ventricle. And the right ventricle is more pouch-shaped than round. All of those are significant. If we think about the right ventricle, it has to pump blood to the lungs and back, right? It's going to the lungs and back. That's it. It has to create enough pressure to get that blood from the center here out to your lungs. Your left ventricle has to create enough pressure to get blood all the way to your head and your toes. So your left ventricle has thicker walls and it develops more pressure, right? The muscles beat kind of stronger to make more blood pressure so that you can get that blood to travel further. And that's what this slide is trying to show you. And so you can see here, this is a dissection through the heart, kind of an oblique dissection through the heart. You can see the right ventricle and the left ventricle. The right ventricle always looks smaller. If you cut the heart in half, if you do a frontal section of the heart, the right ventricle always looks smaller. And it's because it has a lot less muscle around. You can see that the muscle around it is much thinner, right? The layer of muscle around it is much thinner. The layer of muscle around the left ventricle is much thicker. The left ventricle is creating more force because it has to push the blood further. Here's a view from the top, both when it's relaxed and when it's contracted. The heart valves prevent backflow, right? The AV valves are between the atria and the ventricles. So when the ventricles contract, the pressure inside the ventricles causes the valves to slap shut. That makes sense. The ventricles squeeze, the pressure goes up inside that ventricle, those valves slap shut, so that blood can't flow backwards. It can only flow into the arteries. The semilunar valves are the ones that are in the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. They prevent blood flow. They prevent backflow of blood to the ventricles. There are no muscular braces for these, like we saw with the chordae tendineae and the AV valves. But basically, the blood just slaps back against those valves, so they slap shut, so that the blood cannot enter the ventricles. Okay, and here's a picture of the heart from above. So what they're showing here are the AV valve. This is the right AV valve and the left AV valve. And here are the aortic valves and the pulmonary valves, the semilunar valves. When the AV valves are open, the semilunar valves are shut. When the semilunar valves are open, the AV valves are shut. It always has to be that way. Okay, so here's the opposite situation, right? The AV valves are closed, the semilunar valves are open. Now, once you get through all that, we get into something called coronary circulation. So if we think about things, we think about the heart. The heart itself is made of muscle. Muscle contracts. In order for muscle to contract, it needs energy. So how do all of our cells make energy? All of our cells need oxygen to make energy. How do we get oxygen to our cells? We get oxygen to our cells through our blood. So even the cells that make the heart, which pump blood to the rest of the body, they need their own source of oxygen so that they can make energy. And that's where the coronary circulation comes in. You have these little tiny blood vessels, and I say tiny because compared to the big vessels that leave the heart, they are really small. And what they're doing is they are bringing oxygen to the actual heart. So I skipped ahead to this picture because it's a little easier to describe in a picture. So remember when we were talking about the anatomy, we said there's a groove between the atrium and the ventricle called coronary sulcus, and that groove is filled with blood vessels. And then there's also an anterior interventricular sulcus. There's one on the posterior side as well. And those grooves are both filled with vessels. So why do we have vessels there? These vessels are the vessels of the coronary circulation. The red vessels are arteries, and they all branch off of this aortic arch, right? You can see one right here. You see another one right here. And they are bringing oxygenated blood to parts of the heart. So that these cells in the ventricle, these muscle cells in the ventricles and in the atria, have energy. They have oxygen so they can make energy. Once these vessels give up oxygen, that deoxygenated blood comes back through these blue veins into the right atrium. So you can see these go back into the right atrium. These veins wrap around the back of the heart and they enter the right atrium from the back of the heart. And you can see that they wrap around, here they are, wrap around to the back of the heart and they enter the right atrium from the back. You need to know the names of these vessels of the coronary circulation. There's not really, I don't have any real good tricks to remembering them other than trying to remember them and memorize them. The anterior interventricular artery, right? That's pretty easy because that's the anterior side of the heart, and that's the interventricular sulcus, right? That runs between the right and left ventricles. On this side over here, you have the right coronary artery, which branches into like the marginal artery, right? And the veins all have different names. Usually when we get to the next chapter, we'll see that the arteries and the veins tend to have the same names. In the case of the coronary circulation, they have different names. You have there's a small cardiac vein, you have these anterior cardiac veins, and then over here on this side, you have the great cardiac vein, right? So we have to know what these are, right? Those veins all lead into this coronary sinus, which leads back into the right atrium, so that deoxygenated blood goes back to the right atrium of the heart. Okay, and so here's a picture of a cadaver's heart. Coronary circulation, the veins and the arteries are dyed blue and red, so you can see them here. So what happens oftentimes when you hear about somebody having a blockage, it's of a coronary artery they're usually talking about. So look at how small the diameter of these are compared to the diameter of something like your aorta, right, or your vena cava. They're really small. So sometimes just due to genetics, sometimes due to diet, you can get blockages in these veins or in these blood vessels. So let's imagine that you had a blockage in this particular artery, right down here, right where the marginal artery branches off. So say you had a blockage in that artery. So now all of a sudden you cannot get oxygenated blood to this part of your heart. That means the cells in this part of your heart can't get oxygen, which means they can't make energy. They can't make energy, they can't contract. So what happens now is all of these cells are still contracting, but these cells are not, right? And the heart, when it contracts, you want all of the muscle cells to contract at once. But if some of them can't get any oxygen or any energy, well, they're not going to contract. So your heart doesn't contract with as much force. The end result of that is you're not pumping as much blood to your entire body as you need to be, right? And so certain parts of your body are not getting enough oxygen. That's what leads to a heart attack. Okay, a heart attack is usually because part of your heart is not getting enough oxygen. Therefore, those cells cannot pump, right? Those cells cannot contract and cannot push the blood. And so your heart is not contracting with enough force. Now, one way that this is alleviated, right? You guys have heard of arthroscopy, right? Where they go in and they actually, sorry, that's not the word, but the angioplasty is the word I was looking for. They go in and they actually go into these arteries and they take a little tiny balloon and it's on a needle. So they thread this needle through an artery where the blockage is, and they inflate that balloon once they get in there. When they inflate the balloon, they hopefully push the blockage to the side so it opens that artery back up, right? Then they deflate the balloon, they pull it out. And so now that blockage is to the side. That's kind of the first thing they'll do. That's angioplasty. A lot of times when they do that, they put in something called a stent. And you may have heard of that before. A stent is basically a meshwork. So now they put in the balloon, they blow it up, and they put in this meshwork that keeps everything pushed to the side. So you kind of always have this hole going through the middle. That's the theory behind it. It works in, I think I've read like about 50% of the cases it works, right? A lot of times the blockage comes back. And so one of the things they can do is something called bypass surgery or bypass graft, or CABG, coronary artery bypass arterial graft. What they can do is they can take a blood vessel from somewhere else in the body, usually from the leg. They cut off a blood vessel from somewhere else in the body because you have, what we'll see is you have a lot of redundant blood vessels. You have certain areas of the body where you have multiple blood vessels going to that area. So they could take a blood vessel from somewhere else in your body and they might sew that blood vessel onto the aortic arch and sew the other end onto the heart here. And so blood can flow through that new vessel and literally bypass the blockage. Okay, so now the person can get blood going from the aorta to that part of their heart. Hopefully they can get, that means they can get oxygen going there. Hopefully those cells will start to beat again. That's what bypass surgery is. And they've done that for what, 50 years successfully, which is amazing to me. They just take a blood vessel from somewhere else in your body and they essentially sew it back on there. So if you've ever heard of somebody having bypass surgery, these are the vessels we're talking about. We're talking about the coronary vessels. So we just went through a lot of that. So we get to, so know the anatomy of the heart, know the coronary circulation. Then we get to a part of the heart called the conducting system, right? The conducting system is how do we get the signal that tells the heart cells to beat? We don't have to get the signal from our brain to our heart, right? You don't ever have to think about making your heart beat. As a matter of fact, you can't, right? The heart, the blood vessel, or I'm sorry, the muscles, the cardiac muscle cells are involuntary. So you can't tell them to beat, they just do. It turns out that within the heart, embedded in the heart, are tissues that start that signaling process. So you don't have to get a message from your brain to your heart. the message from your brain to your heart will tell your heart to slow down or speed up. Okay, but it doesn't actually tell it to beat. What happens with the heartbeat is there's kind of the single cardiac contraction, right? You want all those muscle cells to contract at once. You want all the heart chambers to contract in a series. You want the atria to contract, and then a split second later, the ventricles contract. And the conducting system consists of cells that are actually embedded in the heart. The first set of cells are called the pacemaker because they set the pace for how fast the heart will beat. Okay? And they are in the sinoatrial node, which is called the SA node, which is in the wall of the right atrium, near the top of the right atrium. And these cells in the sinoatrial node, they send a signal to all the muscle cells around both atria to tell them to contract. A split second later, you have cells at this AV node, the atrioventricular node, which sits at the junction between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And that sends a signal to all of the cells surrounding the ventricles, telling them to contract. And these conducting cells, the cells that can actually receive the signal and transmit it to the next cell, are found all through the heart. We have this AV bundle and bundle branches and Purkinje fibers. So I'm going to show you. Oh, there was one that opened. Okay. So here's the heart, right? At the top of the right atrium is the sinoatrial node. That's the pacemaker. And if you look at the purple is showing where that cell, so it originates here, the cell signal, and it travels through all these cells. The AV valve or the AV node is right here between the atria and the ventricle. And that's going to send signals down this interventricular septum, so down the middle of the heart between both ventricles. Those are called bundle branches. And it's going to come back up through Purkinje fibers, which come back up the outside of both ventricles. And so that signal is going to start here. It's going to come down the middle of both ventricles, back up the sides of both ventricles, telling those muscle cells to contract. Okay. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to stop there. I think we went through a lot for today. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to post this lecture later on. And what we will do is we will finish this up on Friday. So if you guys have any questions when you watch this, or if you have any questions about any other things, please feel free to email me. We will go ahead with this chapter on Friday and we'll finish it up. And if you have any questions, I'll get back to you as soon as possible. So thank you, and I hope you have a great week. Bye.